It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us is one of the team members over at the Catholic Distance University, Dr. Carole Brown. Thanks for being here, Dr. Brown.
Thanks so much, Kyle, for having me.
So one of the things that one of the many things that you're an expert in, I should say, is spiritual accompaniment. And Pope Francis has talked about spiritual accompaniment in his encyclical Joy of the Gospel. U.S. bishops have been talking about the need for spiritual accompaniment. And to be honest, I don't really know what this means. So what is spiritual accompaniment?
Great question. Well, Pope Francis talks about this at length in his apostolic exhortation, Joy of the Gospel. If you feel like picking it up sometime, about sections 169 through 173, it's really integral to his vision of discipleship. We've been talking a lot in recent years about this whole phenomenon of intentional discipleship. Mm-hmm. And so accompaniment is something that happens when one who's been following Jesus and practicing the spiritual life with some intentionality for some time advises someone who's a little bit more of a beginner, who wants to grow in the spiritual life. So it's really an essential component to discipleship. St. Paul, for example, was a mentor to Timothy. You remember that time in one of the epistles to Timothy, he says, don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, but set an example for them, and just gave that encouragement to Timothy to not be intimidated by people just because they were older than him, because he had this inner life going on that was exemplary, and Paul wanted everybody to know about it. So Paul kind of mentored him along, and as we're growing in the spiritual life, we also need mentors. In some ways, in the culture of our parishes and in our culture as a church, spiritual conversation is not common. Our spiritual life is something we don't talk about very much. We have kind of this taboo about it, that we can only talk about it in very kind of rarefied and special environments. And it isn't necessarily very common or normal or something people experience very much, just to talk about God while they're driving down the road in the car together, or out to lunch or whatever. So spiritual accompaniment is something that I think the Spirit is saying in the church these days, that we need to, those of us who've got some traction in our spiritual life, need to talk out loud about it, and we need to mentor and accompany people that are still trying to get their legs under them, so to speak.
Sure.
Does that help?
Yeah. So if we're looking at, say, a 10-point scale here, is this just for 10s should spiritually accompany those that are lower than them? Could it be like a 5 mentoring a 3, or is it really looking for, is it like no matter where you are, you can accompany somebody who's below you, and maybe no matter where you are, you should be looking for somebody that's above you to mentor you?
I think that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And as far as the numerical scale, I think that's a good analogy. It's very American to want to quantify things, So, but to be honest with you, the very first person who accompanied me was 14 years old. We were both 14 years old.
Okay.
And she was a girl that I went to high school with, and we were having a sleepover one night, and I was complaining about my problems, and she just listened to me for a long time. And then she said, Carole, have you ever prayed about this?
Huh.
And I was completely shocked by that question, because I knew my prayers. I knew the Our Father and the Hail Mary and the Creed. I knew all the prayers, and I said them religiously every night. But to pray about something was a whole different idea. What she was implying was that I could talk to God about the things that were bothering me, that I was talking to her about. And that just was revolutionary for me at that time. And she was the person who gave me a Bible. She gave me some Christian music. We saw each other every day at high school. This was back in the days of passing notes. We didn't have text, and so we would pass notes back and forth, and we would share, what the insights were that were coming to us in the scriptures, or wondering what God is doing in this or that situation. And it was a beautiful example of spiritual accompaniment. And I still marvel at the fact that a 14-year-old girl could diagnose the fact that I was not praying. I was not praying in a meaningful way or a fruitful way, and she knew what to do to help me with that. So yeah, I don't think you have to be this paragon of wisdom and information. I don't think you have to be marvelously advanced as a saint or anything like that. You just have to be paying attention, and of course she was paying attention in her own spiritual life. She had a spiritual life. She had a confident trust in God. I could hear it in her voice. I'd never heard anybody talk with such confidence about God as she did. And it really shifted something for me, So yeah, I don't think anybody is off the hook on this because they're not, far enough along. You don't have to be a saint to do this.
Yeah. So getting back to maybe overemphasis on quantifying things here, what would the Venn diagram look like between spiritual direction and spiritual accompaniment? Would all spiritual direction also be spiritual accompaniment, but not all spiritual accompaniment be spiritual direction?
I think that's a good way to describe it, yeah.
Okay.
Spiritual direction, especially if it's good spiritual direction, is always a kind of spiritual accompaniment. But not all spiritual accompaniment is spiritual direction. Spiritual accompaniment encompasses, spiritual friendship. It encompasses things that happen in moms' play groups when two moms get together and they share about what's happening in their prayer, when they encourage each other. I even think some spiritual accompaniment happens over the radio, like what we're doing right now. People driving down the road who are kind of in the quiet of their own thoughts, and they happen to tune into this, and all of a sudden they're engaged in a spiritual conversation that we're having.
Mm-hmm. So
it doesn't necessarily even have to be face-to-face, although I think that's the best way, when you're actually in a trusting friendship with somebody. And I don't know if you might have followed there's a kind of a movement afoot in the United States. There was a marvelous book put out a few years ago called Forming Intentional Disciples. And
Sure.
It talks about these 5 thresholds that people move through before they come to a real commitment to Jesus. And the author of the book, Sherry Waddell, talks about having, she's part of an organization called the Catherine of Siena Institute, and they were putting on charism workshops for many years across the United States, and she was operating on the assumption, she was a convert to the Catholic faith, she was operating on the assumption that, she noticed that Catholics didn't talk about their faith very much, and she just thought it was because there was something so profound and so deep going on with Catholics that they couldn't talk about it. It was just too deep, And so anyway, one day she was interviewing a lady who had gone through the charism workshop, and she asked this woman this question: tell me about your lived experience with God, or tell me about your lived relationship with God. And this woman looked at her funny, and she said, well, I don't have a relationship with God. And Sherry was completely astounded by that, and she spent the next hour, trying to tackle it from different directions, thinking the lady maybe just didn't have the language to, put into words what she was experiencing. And after quizzing her for the better part of an hour, they both agreed, yeah, this woman doesn't have a relationship with the Lord. And afterwards, she and her ministry partner, Father Michael Sweeney, were talking about it, and Father said, maybe we should ask that question more often. And as they began to ask that question more often, they found that across the board, in thousands and thousands of interviews, the same thing was coming up, that people just didn't know what it meant to have a relationship with the Lord. And for many of them, this was the first conversation that they'd ever had where somebody asked them about that, or where they heard that it was even possible to have a relationship with the Lord, So, and I think, too, that, to be honest with you, that, and I hope not to offend anybody in this comment, but, we lose about 70% of our baptized people by the time they finish college. And of those that remain in the church, they don't all, they haven't all experienced a fulfilled conversion, so to speak. And so there's a handful of people in the church who really have experienced that relationship with the Lord and that kind of living faith, who in some ways feel kind of marginalized or kind of, I don't know, different, I guess, because they do have one. And so they tend to be a little bit shy about talking about it because people look at them funny and, find this a bit strange. And I really think it behooves us, those of us who have had that experience, to start talking more about it and to start pushing the envelope a little bit in terms of encouraging people to discover that and to share our own life, our faith, our testimony with them in sensitive ways. We don't have to plow people over with it, but accompaniment really kind of means that. It means starting that conversation, what's the Lord been doing in your life lately?
Yeah, you make it sound so simple, and I think it can be that simple, but what are some things that can help us to know the right things to do or the right things to say? Any resources, any books or something for kind of preparing us to be better at spiritually accompanying people?
Well, there hasn't been a lot of writing on it. I would recommend just going and looking at Evangelii Gaudium in those sections I mentioned above, kind of 169 and following. And then there's another little book that the U.S. bishops have put out called Living as a Missionary Disciple, and there's a whole section in there about accompaniment. And it just basically talks about we're called to create this culture of encounter and witness in the church, and our discipleship is supposed to be explicit. And in a lot of ways, we've lived it more implicitly, but we can't do it alone. I'll tell you the honest truth. The girl who was that catalyst for me was not Catholic. She was a Lutheran. And for months I thought, is this right? Can this be right? I don't know any Catholics who read the Bible. I don't know any Catholics who talk about Jesus this way, And thanks be to God, I also had an excellent catechist for confirmation who explained the Catholic proposal to me. And because I had this love for Jesus, the church made sense to me and has always made sense to me. But I don't know if I hadn't had that attachment to Jesus, if I would have been able to really embrace the church as fully as I did and have. So I think that in our present culture, there probably is a little bit of risk-taking here, to venture a spiritual conversation with somebody where you're not really exactly sure where they're at and just see where it goes. I remember one experience that I had years ago, and I think the biggest thing with to be honest with you, with spiritual accompaniment is to be living deeply from this relationship with Jesus yourself. So having a regular prayer life yourself, seeking that conversation with the Lord that takes you really deep to the point that you almost can't stand not being able to share it. I think that's really where the wellspring of all of this comes from. I remember as a college kid, I had to commute to college, and I was in a carpool. There were 4 women in this carpool, and we had a 50-mile commute back and forth from school. And I had been in the carpool for a couple of months, and we were, there's always this kind of superficial talk going on, and it happened to be, for me, kind of a stressful year. We had a couple of crises in our family, a couple of deaths in our family that were traumatic, and so that put a lot of pressure on me in terms of getting my homework done and all that kind of stuff. So I was under a fair bit of stress. And anyway, carpool showed up one day. I jumped in the car, and the lady who was driving, she said, "So, Carole, how's life?" And what popped out of my mouth completely surprised me. I just said, "Oh, the Lord has been helping me so much." It just fell out of my mouth. I wasn't planning to have this conversation or anything, but the next thing out of her mouth was, "Oh, is your faith important to you, Carole?" And I said, "Well, yes, it is, as a matter of fact." And we ended up talking about faith all the way in that 50-mile car ride back and forth. And she shared with me that she was Catholic, but not very, she's fairly lukewarm. She admitted to herself and to me that it was a fairly lukewarm experience, and it just ended up being this 100 miles that day of conversation about faith, and just being kind of relaxed about it, I guess, is what I would say. I didn't feel uncomfortable with her. She seemed to have a certain amount of trust and curiosity with me, and I don't know where anything ever ended up with her, but it was a good experience for both of us. So in a certain sense, I wasn't taking a huge risk here. Like I said, as the Spirit prompted me, it just fell out of my mouth, and I almost wanted to cover my mouth up, after I said, "Oh, the Lord has been helping me so much." But it became the catalyst to this great conversation, And I think that part of that was just because I was living out of a very deep lived relationship with the Lord, where He was helping me so much, and I just couldn't help but express, that I am being helped, and that became the catalyst to a great conversation. I was mentioning this book, Forming Intentional Disciples. Sherry talks about these 5 thresholds in there that people journey through on their way to commitment to Christ. I think it's great for all of us to kind of become familiar with those thresholds and to be able to sort of assess, have I got this kind of trusting relationship with somebody that I can talk freely about these things, or is there no trust established yet? I've known situations where, no trust established yet, no bridge there yet, and people will start plowing into moral problems, and the bridge is just broken, I think morality is probably not the best place to start in spiritual accompaniment. It comes around later. I had a college friend years and years ago who, best friend in college for a time, and she had a lot of personal problems. She had been in treatment for alcoholism and whatnot, and anyway, she dropped out of school at a certain point, and when I saw her the following summer, I found out that she had become engaged in a deeply immoral pattern in her life. And it was a time, this not to give away my age or anything, but this was before the catechism had been put out, so it was the 80s, and it was a time when there was a lot of confusion in the church. There was a lot of things seemed up in the air. A lot of things did not seem to be defined, and so she had gone off the rails kind of in her moral life, and I felt kind of like, well, who am I to judge? And I didn't want to come across as judgmental, so I didn't say anything, but I felt bothered about it. And then in 1994, the Catechism came out, and there was a lot of clarity there for us about what the Church actually taught about these things. And I began to become more and more concerned about the direction that her life had taken. We kept in touch over the years, and that one day, I think it was at Mass, and Scripture came up from Ezekiel where it says, "Son of man, if I tell you to go tell so-and-so to quit sinning and you don't tell them, I'm going to hold their sin over your head." And I really felt personally convicted that the Lord wanted me to talk to her about this. And I said, okay, Lord, well, if you want me to talk to her about it, you need to set up a situation for me because I kind of don't know how to get there. So as it happened, the Lord did that. He set up a situation for me, and it was a little bit like, volleyball, volley for serve. He set it up for me, and I spiked it. And she realized I didn't support her in the lifestyle that she'd taken, and we just had this long conversation about my concern about the direction that her life was going in, and so over the next 6 years, really, we were having these conversations on the telephone, and I had resolved to myself that I had brought it up, I had told her what I was concerned about, and as far as I was concerned, my duty was done. I didn't have to do anything else. I didn't have to say it again. I didn't have to beat her over the head with it. I didn't have to confront her about it constantly. But she was the one who kept bringing it up, and we kept having this conversation about, the direction that life was going. And anyway, she came to see me in the year 2000, the year of the Great Jubilee, Thanksgiving, and I took her to Mass with me. She was completely obnoxious, during Mass, and it was really embarrassing. But anyway, after Mass, I said, well, what would you think about going to confession? And she said, confession? Why would I want to do that? And I thought, well, okay, I tried. So anyway, the next morning, we were having our coffee, and she said, so if I did want to go to confession, what would that involve? And I said, well, you need to make a good examination of your conscience, and I will call a priest. And that afternoon, not without some significant spiritual battle, that afternoon she met with a priest, and she confessed. She'd been away from the church for 18 years, and she confessed her sins to the priest. She went to communion the next morning on her birthday in the year of the Jubilee, and went home and broke up the situation that she was in, and started going back to Mass, and has been pretty much faithful ever since. She's had a few hiccups here and there, but accompaniment can be these instantaneous things, like my journey with the lady in the car, who I'm no longer in touch with, or it can be these long-term things, where you're kind of arguing for somebody's soul over the course of some years, and really trying to follow the guidance and leading of the Holy Spirit. If I had jumped on her on day one about the morality issues in her life, it probably would have gone nowhere, but right. Over those many years, we continued to keep in touch. She appreciated my friendship, and I had earned the right to be heard in a certain sense when the Lord set that situation up for us, and then, to not pester her about it, but let her bring it up from then on, and which she did, because the Holy Spirit was nagging her and was bothering her about this. I remember she used to always say to me after some of our phone calls, "Oh, you bug me." Funny enough, the night that we had the conversation where she realized I wasn't supportive of her in the lifestyle she'd chosen, I kind of was thinking that perhaps our friendship wouldn't go on from there. I thought maybe she would just stop being friends with me. But contrary to my expectation, she reached across the table and she patted my arm and she said, "You are a dear." I couldn't believe it. I mean, here I am, being really frank and honest with her about, I don't think this is a good direction you've chosen. I think it's not leading to somewhere good. And sensing, expecting that might be the end of our friendship if I said that. And in fact, in some weird kind of way, it brought some strange consolation to her, and even deepened our friendship. So now, these many years later, she's become a faithful witness to the faith, and it's been a beautiful thing to journey with her.
Yeah.
Had that opportunity many times since then too, with other people. So, and sometimes not as fruitful. Sometimes, similar situations where people have cut me off from time to time when it went there. And so anyway, that's the delicacy, I suppose, of the sensing out what is the Lord leading me to in this situation, and following His guidance in it.
Yeah. Well, and I think your examples point out that it might be easier than we think, and maybe the person that you need to spiritually accompany might be sitting right next to you right now.
Yeah, right.
So,
Yeah, it doesn't have to be this big formal program.
Right.
It can be your sister, it can be your brother, it can be an old buddy from college or whatever.
Well, good.
So,
Well,
yeah.
Thank you for that explanation. What is going on at the Catholic Distance University right now?
Well, what I teach at Catholic Distance University is a course called Applied Christian Spirituality, and it is an 8-week course that kind of helps you to get some very practical guidance from the Church and skills from the Church's treasury of spirituality. Well, I spent some time with St. John Paul II, but a lot of time with St. Ignatius and St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, and a number of other topics that we get into. We also have a program called, it's the MA in Theology for Educational Ministry. And one of the facets of that program is that we have a component of it that's called personal and spiritual integration. And basically, a lot of the people that come for that course are planning to be educators in the faith on one level or another. They're going to teach in a Catholic school, they're going to be a catechist, they're going to be doing some kind of faith formation with people. And what we have realized over many years of experience with this is a lot of times Catholic teachers don't know how to pray. They've never been led into a relationship with the Lord, and so they're teaching from a deficit situation. They can't execute their vocation in the school or in the church because they're not spiritually rooted themselves. And so one of the things that we do as a component of that integration is I did my doctoral work on the conversion of the baptized in the thought of John Paul II, and I've identified from his writing 9 component experiences of a fulfilled conversion. And so they do a little bit of self-examination on those 9 components, and they sort of assess where they're at in terms of their own conversion, and they try to identify where are the areas that seem to need some attention. And then we help them to develop a spiritual game plan, and we have a couple conversations on the phone over the course of a couple of years, and kind of help them to get their bearings. And it's been a really beautiful experience with almost all of them. We find as we open up this conversation, it's another kind of spiritual accompaniment. As we open up the conversation, we often find that there's some hitch somewhere, where maybe they have not gone to confession for many years, and they've got a block on that. We kind of talk about that, and oftentimes the Lord will move them past that block once they've kind of been able to just air it out. Learning how to make a daily personal habit of prayer with some Lectio Divina, maybe some journaling or something like that, and just to try to work on some of the heart and habit skills of discipleship that will really enrich them in their teaching experience, and obviously with the student as well, with their experience of being taught. It's a whole different thing to be in a Catholic school environment where there are teachers that are really in love with the Lord and living a deep, powerful spiritual life versus being in a Catholic school where the spiritual life really isn't very important to any of the teachers. Very different environment.
Yeah.
Can be created.
So best place to find more information is to go to the website?
Yep, www.cdu.edu.
All right. Again, that's Catholic Distance University, cdu.edu. Thank you so much, Dr. Carole Brown, for sharing this with us, telling us all about spiritual accompaniment. Appreciate it.
You're most welcome, Kyle. Thank you so much for having me.